Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the fourth, and I decided it'll be the last in the series of four webinars that I've done called Your Content Only Better. I started the series by talking about what content optimization software is, why companies are adopting it, what sort of applications they're adopting it for, what they're getting out of it. I've also talked about I gave a webinar on what it's like to use the software and walk through all the different various ways to use it. And then in the last webinar, I talked about how to build a business case for adopting content optimization software such as Acrolinx. And then finally, today's webinar, talking about how you implement content optimization software. So my name is PG Bartlett. I'm your only presenter today. I've been with Acrolinx about 9 months, but I've been working for companies involved in automating the process of creating and sharing content for the last 18 years. Very glad to be part of Acrolinx because, like most, if not all of you, I love language. This is an organization that loves language. And if you've been to past webinars, you know that I like to show quotes from other people exalting language as well. So before we get started, I made a promise in the last webinar that I was going to ask this question about Agile. Some people are doing Agile development. There's 3 polling questions. We're going to go ahead and start with this first question, which is, if you're Agile, and if you're not, you can just click answer E. But if you are Agile, when do you edit your content? Do you edit during each sprint? And you may edit during sprints. You may decide that you're going to edit only during the so-called hardening sprints. Not everybody does hardening sprints because some purists don't like that. If your product is always supposed to be ready to go, then having a hardening sprint where you make it better and focus on quality is not something that's supposed to happen separately. Not getting a lot of answers here, probably because not a lot of you, well, no, actually I'm getting a lot of answers, which is we're not doing Agile. So not such an interesting question to most of you. I'll go ahead and close the polls and share the results so you can see that, we have just a handful of answers from you all. And it looks like many of you decided not to vote at all. So there's the results. I'm not sure if even the person who wanted this poll is online, but we'll move right along now. All right. So the agenda. I'm going to take you through what it's like to implement content optimization software like Acrolinx. And so I'll start with the end. What do you get at the end of a project like this? And then I'll go on to roles and responsibilities. Who do you have to have on board, and what do those people need to do? And then we'll talk about project phases and milestones. How does the project go? What are the key steps? And during the course of all of this, I'll be offering various tips that I've learned in the course of working with our professional services team, as well as with an outside consultant, and I'll give her a mention at the end as well, and then talk about potential pitfalls. There will be a short commercial about Acrolinx at the end, and then we'll get to questions. A lot of things to cover today, but a lot of these slides shouldn't take too much time to cover. So I have one more polling question before we get into the meat of this, which is, why are you here? What do you plan to get out of this? Are you working right now and preparing to implement content optimization software? Do you have no firm plans, but you just want to prepare mentally? Answer C, of course, are you just curious, or is there some other reason I haven't thought of that I didn't put as a choice here? And if you're kind enough to share your thoughts, if it's another reason, which I didn't name, and gosh, there's a few of you who at least have answered that way, if you wouldn't mind sending me an email at the end of this presentation, that'd be great. I'll have my email address up at the end. You could also put it in the question panel as an answer to me, and that way I'll have it, and not everyone else will see it, or you can just put it in the chat panel, and everyone can see what the other reason was. So I'll go ahead and close and share the results with you. You can see that it's almost half of you, well, 40% are preparing, 20% no firm plans, almost a third just curious, and 10% have another reason than one of those, which I find intriguing. Okay, so what's the result? What should you have at the end of this project? Well, software a project involving Acrolinx, then it's Acrolinx software installed on your server or servers and on all the desktops of all the users who are going to have access to it. Presuming that you're using Acrolinx with desktop authoring tools. Acrolinx also works in web-based tools, in which case there would be nothing installed on the user's desktop. The rules for spelling, grammar, and style, tone of voice, that would be configured to your requirements. You'd have built at least the starting point for a terminology database with all of your keywords and phrases installed. Everyone's trained up. And you have a starting point for being able to keep track of content quality on an ongoing basis. We'll start with a baseline report, and even during the implementation phase, keep track of content quality changes, and then over time you'll be able to continue to keep track. So that's what you end up with at the end of the implementation project. Now, you may be asking yourselves, can I just do it myself? DIY, do it yourself? This is not really a technology problem. So in theory, you could. But there are some areas where there are some skills needed. In particular, it takes an Acrolinx linguist to modify the style rules, to customize the style, grammar, tone of voice rules. That does take specialized skills and education and experience, and that is something that only someone with a lot of experience can do. We don't provide any way for customers to do it themselves, although customers can turn off style rules or turn them back on. Setting up the terminology, it's not that much skill required. It's more like you have to learn how to do it and what you're doing, and that's not very involved. But that takes some training time. And then, of course, users need to be trained, and having someone who's already trained users and knows how to train users is very valuable to have. Now, we happen to offer a services package we call 10-10-10. And so this presentation is modeled on how that 10-10-10 service package goes. It's called that because you can see what's involved here. Suitable for most implementations. It may be overkill for the very smallest ones, certainly not enough for the largest ones, but it's a good middle ground. And so when I talk about how many days something will take or how projects typically go, I'm talking about the mainstream implementation that we do. So if you're interested in DIY, then you may be thinking, well, why am I even here? And the answer is, I think it's still very helpful to know what to expect during the course of the project. Second, to get the best out of the project. How do you get the most out of this? And that's a combination of what you should do and what you should not do. What I found especially interesting as I got into preparing for this webinar is that this is not a product problem. This is not a technology problem. Implementing this software is about people and process, not about product. So the product, the technology involved is relatively simple. Unless you're doing some integration with a content management system or some ERP system or something else, which even then isn't very complicated, this is really much more out of the box than, say, the world I came from, which was XML authoring and publishing. That's where I spent most of my years in this, and that was a lot of technology as well as a lot of people and process impact. So let's start with the roles and responsibilities. Here are the 6 key roles that are involved, and we'll go through each. I've got a slide on each of these, so you don't need to bother memorizing this page. I just point out that the linguistic administrator, you'll often hear us refer to that as the Ling admin, because of course, language has a way of getting shortened for convenience. So the sponsor of the project is typically an executive level or director level person in the organization. That's the person who approves the organization's commitment to the project, the one who approves or is critical to getting funding, the one you've had to convince why you're doing a project, what the business reasons are. This person should participate in the kickoff meeting. Very important to tie the business reasons to the project. It's very important to have the project sponsor there so everyone is reminded we're doing this not just for the fun of it, not just because we love language, but we're doing this for specific business reasons. We need to tie the project to those reasons. And ideally, this person also participates in the acceptance meeting. Now, the project manager is someone within your organization who ideally has a formal background, may have certification in something like PMI, but at the very least knows through experience the importance of schedule, scope, and costs. Those are the things that a project manager has to be cognizant of, and also knows why it's critical to avoid scope creep. I assume everyone here knows what scope creep is, but in case you don't, it's how a project during implementation tends to expand in its scope, expand that is in expectations, and that can have a big impact on both cost and time. So what does a project manager do? It's all about keeping track of what's going on, coordinating what's going on, and communicating about what's going on. So monitoring, coordinating, communicating. It really boils down to that. Now, the terminologist is anywhere from 1 to 3 people, ideally no more, who are going to be responsible for building the terminology database. Often an editor or writer. In large organizations, there may be a terminologist or even multiple terminologists. We've certainly worked with large companies where there are people whose title is terminologist. So this is a person who's responsible for what we call validating the terminology, which means setting it up, entering the terms, and creating links between the preferred terms and the deprecated or prohibited terms. Typically, the time expectation for the terminologist during implementation, during this, say, 10 weeks, is about 10 to 20 hours a week. So it's significant. This is one of the most, in fact, the most significant commitment of time on your part in order to get an implementation set up and working well. That's a role that needs to be available on an ongoing basis to manage terminology changes. Terminology is not a set it up and forget it kind of thing. As your company evolves, you will have new terminology that needs to be implemented. Now, this person can also serve in smaller organizations, maybe the linguistic administrator as well. So some tips here. If you give authority to more than 3 people, it means it takes longer to come to a conclusion. You can imagine there are some knockdown, drag-out battles around terminology. Not all terms, and in fact, that's one of the funny things about it is that it's only about 10 to 20% of the terms that really are controversial. You can get someone to help with the initial terminology validation. You can outsource that. Something to consider as you're setting up the project. But for those terms that you think may be controversial, it's a good idea to identify those terms and have a separate process for resolving those terms. And my advice, by the way, is this separate process doesn't mean that everyone gets a vote. You should try to set up a process so that a group of between 1 and 3 people have the final say, but they get input from a much larger group. That's ideal, and it isn't always practical. Now, in terms of setting up these links between preferred terms and deprecated terms, that's a critical part of the project. If you don't have links set up, then Acrolinx, there's nothing to flag, because Acrolinx can say, well, this term is deprecated, but cannot advise what the term should be replaced with. So the whole point of having links is so you can advise authors what term they should use. A linguistic administrator, the ling and min, could be outsourced as well, but typically it's an editor within the organization. This is, by the way, this is a role that primarily exists during the implementation phase. Now, we do have some very large customers who have ongoing linguistic improvements they want to make. They actually have their own ling and min who even have, who's have a defined role to spend part-time on their job and working on adding rules, but that's unusual. That's a very large company. Typically, it's an editor, someone who knows the corporate style guide or style guides. You may have multiple style guides that you adhere to, not only your own, but you may be based on, say, Microsoft Style Guide or the Chicago Manual of Style. Ideally, someone who understands grammatical syntax, meaning you know what the parts of speech are, you know some of these technical terms that the linguists use, or if you don't know them, you love learning about them and you'll come up to speed on them quickly. I've learned a lot of terms since I joined Acrolinx that I had no idea existed. Like a word can have something called morphology, or language has morphology. It's a fancy word for, well, I won't go into it, but it's an interesting word if you ever want to look it up. So what does Ling and Min do? Primarily, it's about figuring out what rules you want, how the rules are working, that is, test the rules, organizing feedback from authors on their experiences with the rules, and making requests of our linguists to customize those rules. Now, the server administrator, this is just I shouldn't say just, but this is an IT person. So it's not when I said just, I meant not a language person, typically not involved in the authoring and editing process, but still plays a critical role in making sure that the server is available and can install the software on the server, can administer that server. By the way, doesn't have to be a database administrator. Could be, doesn't have to be, not at all required to be. So I'm not recommending it, but it's something at all. It's just there are some customers where that role happens to be a shared role, but not necessary at all. That person also handles updates, especially important to handle updates to both the software and configuration files during the course of implementation, and then on an ongoing basis after the implementation is complete. Okay, so those are the 6 roles that we've just gone through. Now let's talk about the project itself. So here are the 11 or 12 milestones that we're going to go through. And we're going to start even before there's a contract done with your supplier, such as Acrolinx. So there are some steps that happen before there's a contract that's signed, and then, of course, the main body of the work happens afterwards. It's helpful, though, to talk about before the contract is signed because that sets the stage for success at the end. So, during the course of, you'll have your initial contact will be with the Acrolinx sales team. Eventually, when you determine that there is a real business opportunity here, a real business need for what Acrolinx can do, and you want to go further into speccing out what would be involved, that's typically when Acrolinx Professional Services, and you'll see PS a lot during the course of this presentation, that's where they come in. Now, the result of this phase is the implementation team, that is primarily the professional services team, understands your business requirements. They understand what you want to accomplish. And that's the key in order to do 2 things. First, to provide guidance. Here's what you should expect from the project. And also to assess how big this project is and whether or not, in fact, it will be feasible to meet your business requirements. Now, it's your job to make sure that everyone involved understands the expectations that you have, that your team has. So when we talk about, and what the tip is referring to, make sure there's enough conversation, make sure there's sufficient detail. Don't assume that the Acrolinx sales team or professional services team know what you want if you haven't said it. We do work with other companies. We bring a lot of expertise to the table. It's one of the reasons why you involve us, of course, one of the key reasons. But still, every organization has its own needs. So the next step is Acrolinx Professional Services team assesses feasibility. And the result of that is that they agree that either the product can meet the requirements or perhaps they come back and say you have some requirements that you need to modify if you want to have a successful implementation. And then there's a statement of work that lays out for you the scope, the schedule, and the costs, and in particular, the acceptance criteria. This is what our professional services team does. And this is a critical part of what's critical in the statement of work is this acceptance criteria. And you may say, well, really? There has to be some sort of standard for acceptance. Either it works or it doesn't. But we're talking about language here. We're talking about language, and therefore it's not perfect. I'll talk later about the specifics of how we measure perfection in our software when it comes to enforcing the rules. Enforcing is the wrong word. Guiding authors to the rules. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But it is important to establish criteria, and perfection can't be the criteria. Okay, so now we're into the project. the first step in the contract's been signed. Now we're into the into implementation, and this is the first step. Is we need to have some data. Our professional services team needs to have around 1 gigabyte of content, that is text. Obviously, in smaller organizations, it might be harder to get to, but that's what we're aiming for, is to get a broad range of content that can support both the initial testing that we do, as well as support the later testing as we go through stages of this project. It's critical for us to have this. And we've certainly seen lots of implementations where this becomes a bottleneck, where it takes time, and not planning ahead for this can mean extra time cost in the process. But what really starts the project is a kickoff meeting. And everyone involved in the project needs to be at this meeting. The Acrolinx professional services team, as well as all the key roles within your organization, need to be involved. If someone, such as a project sponsor, can't be there, has something more important to do, it increases the risk of success in the project. It's absolutely vital to have everybody there. And this is where all the expectations are set. As a result of this, everyone understands the business objectives and how the project will support those business objectives. Everyone also understands how much is required, who has to do what, how much time will the terminologist need, what are the duties and expectations and time requirements of the linguistic administrator, what does the server administrator have to do. And also everyone understands what how Acrolinx will be performing at the end of this project, as well as what Acrolinx doesn't do. I talked about the limits to perfection a moment ago, and we'll talk more about that later. Now, if you'd like to, in advance of getting started, if you'd like to take a look at the specific activities that your linguistic administrator, server administrator, or terminologist will be doing, you can go to infocenter.acrolinx.com. All you have to remember is InfoCenter. Presumably you know acrolinx.com already. Go to infocenter.acrolinx.com and click on the left side, Acrolinx server documentation. On the right side, you'll see the 3 arrows I'm bringing up now that point to the specific areas that could be of interest. You don't have to sign in for this or log in. It's strangely unprotected content on our website, and this will let you have a look at what activities there are. Now, don't think of this as high-level describing what a linguistic administrator does or even what the responsibilities are. This is really about supporting the activities of those people, but something you may want to take a look at. Some more tips. Change management is a critical part of success in any project like this, any project that's going to involve having an impact on how people work. So our advice is identify what each stakeholder in the project needs, especially your writers and editors. And of course, there are people in the organization who are naturally suspicious of change. And that's just human nature. We all have resistance to change in some aspects of our lives. So this isn't meant to be a criticism. It's just the way we are. Some of us are early adopters of technology in some areas and late adopters of technology in other areas. And I'm the same as anybody in that regard, as are you, probably. So for those who you think are likely to be inclined to be negative or resistant, you should focus on communication that will specifically address their needs. What we have seen again and again is the people who are most resistant tend to be the people who are the most experienced. They're the most passionate people in your organization. They're people who should be listened to and generally people whose opinions should be regarded with some weight. And we find that when they're communicated with successfully and understand what the goals of the project are and have been given time to open their minds to how Acrolinx can contribute to those goals, they often turn into into the strongest supporters of what you're trying to do. Now, part of change management is being aware of what your stakeholders are experiencing and making sure that Acrolinx knows about them. You'd be surprised how often perceived problems are not communicated to Acrolinx until perhaps later in the project, and it's something that's easy for us to fix. You may see problems that are unavoidable that, in fact, we can take care of very easily. So don't be presumptuous that something that you see just has to be part of how the product operates. wish I could think of an example right now, but I heard some good examples during the course of preparing for this webinar. I'm sorry I can't. Oh, I know. One of them was we had a customer who had a lot of terms with a specific format to them. I can't recall now what the format was, but the assumption on the part of the authors was, well, there's no way we could expect the author to sense that these are specific terms because there's so many of them. We don't want to put them in the terminology system, but Acrolinx is flagging them all as errors. But in fact, we were able to write a rule quite easily to identify those terms and no longer flag them. All right, moving on to having governance. Now, governance is just having a structure for agreeing on, for making decisions on all of these things that Acrolinx is going to help you with, style, tone of voice, terminology, and the processes to come to those conclusions. Ideally, you have executive sponsorship for setting up your governance structure, whether you call it the Content Quality Review Board, a Center of Excellence, Community of Practice. Give it a name. That's always good. Make sure the governance is linked to business objectives, and make sure you establish it at the start of the project. I can't emphasize that enough. Don't get into the project and then say, oh, I guess we need a decision process for how we're going to determine what to do when there's disagreements on terminology or style. Do that at the beginning, before the disagreements start. It's necessary to save time, and it's also necessary to get everyone on board with how we're going to, what the process will be for resolving these things before you're actually confronted with one. And most of you probably know there's a lot of passion around the specific terminology to use. Many of us, if not most of us, have been involved in conversations where there are very strongly expressed views, and those are tough ones. And the way to, by the way, one technique that I use to avoid having them become so heated is know who's going to be making decisions and separate input from the decision-making process. Even within Acrolinx here, when pricing or product naming happen to be areas where people have very strong opinions. And so what we've set up is, here's the group or person who will make the final decision, and then my role in that is to gather input. And I will represent your input, all the input fairly. I will have my own recommendation, but it's this other group that I may be a part of, but this other group will be making the final decision. And when people understand that, it takes some heat off of the conversations. Okay, then there's the initial development phase. Actually pretty quick, 5 days. Is typically how much calendar time this will take. Once the professional services team has your test data, once they understand what the business objectives are, once they've had conversations with your linguistic administrators, what they'll do is they'll perform analysis of that data, they'll produce the initial quality reports, and they'll provide an initial version of Acrolinx that's ready to test. Now, during this period, or even before this period, make sure you have hardware set up. Half of the projects that we're involved with get delayed because when we're ready, the hardware isn't. It ought to be the simplest part of a project, but everyone gets frustrated when we're sitting there all ready to go, but there's nothing to run it on. Okay. And then the next step is training. So the software is ready. What we want to do is train people at the point that the software is ready to start to use. Now, use means test. Use test data, use your own data, but we want to combine training and testing together so that there's instant payoff for that training. Then the training itself is pretty easy. As an author or an editor, using the software is very simple, very simple. The training really is more about style guide and what to look for and how to handle false alarms or missing alarms. We'll talk about that more later. But how to handle it when the software doesn't seem to be working as expected. The linguistic administrator, that takes a little more training, and of course the terminologist, that also takes a little more yet. Not a lot. Learning how to use the software is not the big deal. Learning about the process, that is a big deal. Training can take between 1 and 3 days. Our team comes in and trains all the various user types. It does require access to live software, which means it has to be installed both on the server and on the user's desktop. And if it happens to be XML content, the linguistic administrator will need some additional training beyond what's talked about here. So the result is your team is using Acrolinx. They're using it. They're understanding it. They're using it, and they're reporting back on results. It's not enough just to use it and say, here, go at it and see what you come up with. Work with the users in advance so they know what they're going to be doing with it. Not just, well, start using it, but have a test plan prepared in advance. This is something the project manager should do, and it's something that'll be part of the kickoff meeting. Talk about who's going to do it, when it's going to happen, to make sure that when you get to this point, you've got a test plan, you know what you're going to do. So I talked before about this acceptance criteria and how to know when Acrolinx was working, and about the fact that we're dealing here with language. So perfection in language, of course, is impossible to achieve. And I want to give you an idea of the terminology that we use to describe specifically false alarms, that is, Acrolinx flags something that it shouldn't have flagged, and missing alarms, when Acrolinx flags something or fails to flag something that it should have. So in a situation where you have 100% precision and 100% recall, Acrolinx would be perfect. There would be no false alarms. It would flag everything that needed to be flagged. But in the real world, that doesn't happen. And in fact, something you should be aware of, in our experience, if there's more than 5% false alarms, users get frustrated. So 5% is the magic number. We look for precision of 95%, which means we recommend strongly that you be more relaxed on the recall. I guess I should have had this on my slide. Those are important numbers. 95% precision is the goal, and something less is the goal on recall, because there's no way to be perfect on catching alarms, on catching every possible error. What you'll end up with is having too many false alarms. Okay. And then there's the testing iterations. There's a series of 3 iterations that we go through to do testing and provide feedback. So in the first iteration, you can see who's involved, your Ling and Min, your authors and your editors, typically a 2-week calendar time period where you have authors and editors using the software, going through your test plan, and providing feedback on precision and recall. How many false alarms did it give me, and what alarms is it missing? The job of the linguistic administrator is to review that feedback, and then based on that feedback, develop requests to professional services for rule changes, but also to prioritize those requests, and then enter them into the project management system. We don't use email to try to coordinate all this. The result is we get requests for creating or customizing those rules, and then we process those requests and then do updates. Now make sure you have a process that you agree on for submitting feedback. You can do it via email, that's okay, but you have to do it, and then you have to respond to it. Make sure that the process involves people actually seeing the feedback, that is, professional services seeing that feedback. I think there's one more tip on this slide. Yes, and this is very, very important. One of the most important tips in this presentation. Language, the style guide and the enforcement of the style guide with Acrolinx is about supporting your business objectives. It's not just about supporting good taste. Now, good taste is important. I think almost all of us here love language, and we all have passionate belief about what good taste is in language. It's hard to let go of that, and I don't really want to let go of that. I'm not letting go of that myself. But Acrolinx shouldn't be set up to try to catch everything. So focus on the rules that are going to support your business objectives. Objectives for reducing localization costs, for speaking with one voice, for, of course, improving reading comprehension, for protecting your brand by using the right product names, and, of course, making sure that you make everything clear with customers by using the right terminology. So it's critical to do all of those things. That's what your business objectives are. When it becomes more than that, that's when you need to question whether or not you're putting your priorities on the right things. So meanwhile, while the linguistic administrator and the authors and editors are working on that stuff, what's your terminologist doing? That's the terminology validation process I talked about earlier. It starts with identifying the terminology that has to be managed, either starting with an existing term list or doing harvesting. We have software that can extract what look like likely terms from existing documents as well as from translation memory. There's some cool stuff in there in terms of multilingual term extraction that is an extra service, but it can be highly valuable if you to pull your translations and the translated terms out of your translation memory. Often that terminology needs to be categorized based on domain. That is, you may have different groups using the software and terminology applies to only one group. You can imagine a large organization with diverse products. Terminology doesn't apply to everybody. Some terms are only specific to one group. You'll want to just assign whether or not a term is preferred or deprecated and then do the linking I mentioned earlier. And this is a process that never ends. Meanwhile, what's your project manager doing? What I said before, coordinating, communicating, and monitoring. And then, there are surveys being run, supported by the Acrolinx professional services team, to continually evaluate how the project is going based on user surveys. Testing iterations 2 and 3, pretty much the same as iteration 1. They're continuing to use Acrolinx, they're continuing to report problems, and the Ling and Min is continuing to understand the feedback and prioritize the requests. And at the end of each iteration, there's another software update. That is a configuration update. Sometimes there's actual software updates, but typically it's an update to the configuration files. Now here's a tip that's really valuable. The Acrolinx team knows, based on doing a lot of these projects, which rules bring the most benefit. It's about the top 10 or 15 out of 100 or more that really bring the most benefit in terms of business benefits. So, they're not there to argue with you, but they are there to advise. And they can offer some great advice when it comes to which rules deliver the key benefits. And then the final point, of course, is acceptance. Everyone who is involved at the beginning should be involved at the end. That's when the final testing and user survey are done, and that's when the project, you get the sign-off. So hopefully you've gotten to 95% precision and something less than 95% on recall. So, some do's and don'ts before we get into the questions. Number one problem we see on projects over and over again, and of course this affects every project, every organization, anything that anybody ever does in the world, the number one issue is communicating. So, our advice is to establish how you plan to communicate on all the critical issues. I've talked about that already. We don't recommend relying solely on email. You've seen situations yourselves where everyone is CC'd and no one, or everyone is in the to field and no one knows who's responsible. So we run project management software during the implementation phase. We give your people access to it so that there is a way to communicate. But that's not the only way to communicate. There are others, and you need to keep track of those. Scope creep is a big issue. So that's where the project manager really needs to understand whether a scope change is necessary. Is it necessary to support the business objective? And can it be postponed to a later phase? Now, the last part of the slide here, I was at a conference last week, and one of my favorite presenters, who's been doing XML-based authoring and publishing implementations for a very long time, a guy named Joe Gallner, in his presentation, he said that they rank the importance of requirements in descending order, starting with business priorities. What does the business need? What do you need to accomplish the business result? Second, user priorities, what you need to keep people happy. And third and last, system priorities. And that's when it comes to IT preference for things like we've standardized on such and such a content management system. Well, if that's not critical to meeting business objectives or making users happy, then that gets moved to the third priority. And he pointed out that often, by the time you get to the third priority, those things are just never addressed. And if they're not critical to the business objectives, they're not critical. Okay. Implementing low priority rules, I've beaten this pretty much already, haven't I? After the first 10 rules, you get diminishing returns. And also, we've had to implement rules at the insistence of a customer that actually never get triggered. They're in the style guide, but no one ever violates them. So give some thought to which rules are really important. Now, terminology is a big area. So we have this wonderful term extraction capability, and it is wonderful. But if you have a term list, then don't use term extraction, because all you're going to do is get a lot of noise. You know, it's designed to be it's designed to have a lot of noise. It's not precise. It's designed for maximum recall and low precision. So if you can start with a term list that already exists in your organization in an Excel file, in a Word document, they can be extracted and put into Acrolinks. Be careful not to make your terminology list that you start with too big. What's too big? You have to decide. It depends on how many people you have to address it. But, you know, a few hundred terms you can deal with. 10,000 terms, that's too much for phase one. Don't try to put all of it in up front. You can phase it in over time. And in particular, you got to be careful with overcommitting the resources. Anyone who cares about terminology needs to be included early and throughout. You can't ignore them till the end, because they can throw a flag in the play and stop you at the end. Make sure you agree on everyone agrees on a workflow for how you're going to decide who can contribute, who has to review it, and who gives approval. And set that workflow up at the start. Okay. Don't mean to yell, but this is an area that can cause some pain. Certainly, if no one's watching the progress against the schedule, that's an issue. The project manager has to remain aware of where the project is compared to where it was supposed to be, make sure the resources are available when they're needed to be, and communicate when anything is going wrong or might go wrong. Now, there are risks in a project. What I found interesting is that when I built this list, working with some people who have lots more experience at this than I do, only the first one relates to technology. Everything else is about people and process. So be aware of the people and process issues. Consider those risks and have a plan for dealing with those risks. So, hey, I'm about to get to questions already, which is good, just running right on time. So, as with any other project, good PM practices apply, especially in the area of change management. I love this saying. I'm sure you've all heard it before, that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. So getting people who've already made all the mistakes, well, not all, but have made a lot of mistakes, is invaluable for any project, but especially like this, where it's moderately disruptive to how you've been doing things. Nowhere near as disruptive as something like XML authoring and publishing, which I think is very worthwhile, but certainly a lot more involved in terms of implementation. But the same rules apply. Get people involved who've been there already. Now, a final point, don't roll out too early or too late. If you roll out too early and end up with too many false alarms, users are frustrated and you get a lot of user resistance. They just won't use it. But if you perfect and try to spend, try to get, precision near 100 and recall as close to 100 as you can get it, the risk is that other priorities will intrude and derail the project before it's done. That doesn't happen often, but we've seen it happen, or it can delay. We've seen it delay, suspend implementations in some cases for months. So, a quick overview of Acrolinks, and I also will give you an overview of the partner who helped me with this as well. It came out of a company. The company came out of a research project at the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence. So our founders worked there, computational linguistics. In fact, worked on a project for SAP that they commissioned this research center to do to help them guide authors to creating better content. We're headquartered in Berlin. We have offices in the U.S. I'm here in the Denver office. And my role here, by the way, is I'm responsible for product management. So it's an organization that is headquartered in Berlin, but led by an internationally diverse team. Linguistic competence means strong linguistic functionality in these 6 languages, but when it comes to handling terminology, we can handle terminology in a lot more languages than that. Quite a list. I'm going to skip this slide. I think most of you have seen this before, but I think you already understand now, if you've been through this presentation, that this is, all I'm going to do is tell you what the Acrolink stuff does. We've already gone through all of this. And so we'll conclude with one of my favorite sayings about language. I love this one in particular. This guy is a philosopher, and a nice end to a series of 4 webinars. So, we get to the last polling question, and then I do have a comment about the person who helped me with this, and then we'll move on to questions. So, how satisfied are you with what you learned in this webinar? Very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, neutral, dissatisfied, or you don't want to say, or you're not sure, maybe you came in late, you don't want to hurt my feelings. It's okay if you hurt my feelings. So I'm happy that most of you found it satisfactory. It's nice to see. A surprising number of you are neutral. It's interesting. Usually I have people with feelings, either very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, or dissatisfied. But there's some who don't want to answer. So I'm going to go ahead and close the results and let you see the results. So there we are. Almost 3/4 were very or somewhat satisfied. And then a fifth neutral and a handful not sure, don't want to answer. So, nice. Thank you. Okay, so the person who helped me with this is the woman who started this company, Content Rules. Her name is Val Swisher, and this is a company that provides professional services related to what Acrolinks does, and you can see what kind of things she does there. Her firm also does writing and instructional design, and actually have people who do this stuff that you do as well, and so she provides some outsourcing writing and editing services, as well as implementation services related to what Acrolinks does. And in particular, you can see the kind of things that she can help with in an Acrolinks deployment. And in the slides, I mentioned you'll be able to get the slides, but you can see it's contentrules.com, or you can send an email to info@contentrules.com. Content Rules. Okay. So with that, one more point before we get to questions. And I will stop at the top of the hour. If I don't get to all questions by then, please send me an email. If you want to ask a question that you don't want to ask now, you can send me an email. There's my email address. I'm happy to answer emails, and I always do. The next webinar I'm going to give is on December 5th. Now, the subject I know, but we'll announce it later. I think it's going to be a very interesting subject. And you'll be notified when we're ready to announce the subject. And I'm looking forward to presenting on that. There is a webinar coming up, an English webinar coming up. That is English language. We do German language webinars too, of course, with one of our customers, Philips Healthcare. I think this will prove to be very interesting for you. It's always nice to hear what a customer has to say and share their experiences. So to sign up for that, at our homepage right now, I don't think there's a link on our homepage yet. You'd actually have to, under Join Us, go to View All Events, and then you'll see the Philips Healthcare event sign up, or link to that sign up on that page. If you wait till tomorrow, I think then this will be on the home page. You don't have to go that extra link. As I said earlier at the start, the recording and slides will be posted soon. You could go to acrolinks.com, click on, under Join Us, click on, I think, past events or something, and you'll be able to see, you'll be able to get both the recording and the slides, I mean the recording or the slides, or both, whatever you want, at the end. So now let's go to questions. Finally, you can type your questions in the question box, and I will answer them now, or if I can't answer them now, I will answer them later. Well, there is a dearth of questions. That means there's none. There were some comments, and some nice comments, but no questions. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, I won't keep you hanging on the phone anymore. Thanks to everyone for coming. I appreciate it, and I hope you all have a great rest of the week and a great weekend. So long, everybody. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.